come to order. I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings.
Where exactly does Amazon draw the line?
I'm sorry, aggregate data would be in more than one seller. Okay. And of course, you have to remember that the person seeing the report would have no way of knowing how many sellers are inside that group or what the breakdown would be between those sellers. So, and I would remind you that it's not that different from perhaps a bestseller list or a product ranking, which we do make public for all.
And I just want to be clear, does Amazon allow the use of aggregate data to inform private label Amazon brands when there are only 3 sellers for a product?
Yes, sir.
Does Amazon look at aggregate data when there are only 2 sellers of a product?
Yes, sir.
So, and am I correct in my understanding that Amazon is conducting an internal investigation on the use of third-party data?
Yes, we're basically trying to understand some of the anecdotes that we saw in the Wall Street Journal article.
Will you commit to informing this committee on the outcome of that investigation, including on the exact circumstances of when Amazon is allowed to view and/or use aggregate data?
Yes, we will do that.
And now I want to move, just really quick, music can be used to drive revenue, and obviously there's a reason it's important, and I want to talk about Twitch for a second. News reports have indicated that Twitch users are receiving notice and takedown requests pursuant to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. My understanding is that Twitch allows users to stream music but does not license the music. Is that correct?
I'm going to have to ask that I could get back to your office with an answer to that question. I don't know.
Okay, and then, well, so that would be great. And then, so I just have 2 more questions related to that. If Twitch is responding to DMCA notice and takedown requirements, should Twitch consider proactively licensing music instead of retroactively adhering to those notices? So these are the questions we're interested in. I'm primarily concerned about small, up-and-coming musicians, different people that aren't necessarily labels, to make it as easy for them to at least get cease and desist notices out as well. And as we continue to move forward there.
Yes, Congressman, that's an important issue, and I understand it, and I will get back to your office on that.
All right. Earlier this year, Google announced plans to retire third-party cookies that websites attach to users' browsers, and this allows users to be tracked across the internet. A consequence of that change is that it will put other digital advertising market participants at a disadvantage because they can no longer track users. And at the very, very danger of being pro-cookie, because I'm not when I use my computer as well. And I understand that there are legitimate privacy concerns with third-party cookies, but I do want to focus on the competition aspect. Did this asset action also place Google at a disadvantage, or does Google have alternative means of collecting that user data to inform its digital advertising activities, Mr. Pichai?
Congressman, as you rightly pointed out, this is an area where we are focused on user privacy, and users clearly don't want to be tracked with third-party cookies. In fact, other browser vendors, including from Apple and Mozilla Foundation, have also implemented these changes. We are doing it thoughtfully, giving time for the industry to adapt, because we know publishers depend on revenue in this area. But it's an important change, and I think we have to be focused on privacy to drive the change forward.
But you have other ways of collecting that information, correct?
On our first-party services, we don't rely on cookies, and obviously when people come and type into search...
I'm not asking you if you rely on cookies. I'm asking you if you have other ways of collecting it through Gmail or consumer-facing platforms, right?
We don't use data from Gmail for ads, Congressman, but to the extent on the services where we provide ads, and if users have consented to ads personalization, yes, we do have data.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, during discussions of changing Facebook's platform policy in 2012, you said that, and I quote, "In any model, I'm assuming we enforce our policies against competitors much more strongly." It sounds like Facebook weaponizes its policies to target competitors. Why would Facebook enforce its policies against competitors more strongly?
Congresswoman, when we were a much smaller company, We saw that.
This is
some of our
2012
larger-
now. This was in 2012, so please go right ahead.
Sure. We've had policies in the past that have prevented our competitors, which at the time we were primarily worried about larger competitors, from using our platforms to grow and compete with us. So we had some of those policies. We continually review them over time, and
Okay, Mr. Zuckerberg, in
since
2013,
then,
a
we've
senior
actually-
Facebook employee identified MessageMe as a fast-growing app on Facebook and said that we will restrict their access. Was this another example of enforcing Facebook's policies against competitors much more strongly? MessageMe.
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with that specific example, but we did have that policy.
Okay, let's move to another one and see
evaluated
if
it
you
since
remember
then and
this
changed
one.
the
In
policy.
2014, other Facebook product managers openly discussed removing Pinterest's access to Facebook's platform tools. As one employee said, I am 100% in favor of the idea of moving it from Pinterest, but I am not recommending removing it from Netflix going forward. Why would Facebook product managers want to restrict Pinterest's access to Facebook but not Netflix?
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with that exchange. I don't think I was on that.
Why do you think you wouldn't have to be on that, but why do you think they made that decision or would make a decision like that?
Well, Congresswoman, as I said, we used to have a policy that restricted competitors from using our platform, and Pinterest is a social competitor with us. It's one of the many competitors that allow people to share different types
Okay,
of
Mr.
content with their
Zuckerberg, these
communities.
examples and supporting documents strongly suggest that Facebook does weaponize its platform policies, enforcing them selectively to undermine competitors. But let's move on. Mr. Cook, I am concerned that Apple's policies are also picking winners and losers in the app economy, and that Apple rules mean Apple apps always win. Mr. Cook, in 2019, Apple removed from the Apple Store certain apps that help parents control their children's devices. Do you remember what justification Apple cited?
Yes, Congresswoman, I do. It was that the use of technology called MDM, mobile device management, placed kids' data at risk. And so we were worried about the safety of kids.
Okay, all right. So you were concerned about that the app basically undermined kids' privacy. But another app that used this same tool was Appsure, an app owned by the Saudi Arabian government. Do you recall what Apple's position was towards this app?
I'm not familiar with that app.
Okay, Apple allowed this Saudi app to remain. So there are two types of apps. They use the same tool. Apple kicks one out and said that one that was helping parents, but keeps the one owned by a powerful government. If that is correct, Mr. Cook, that apps that supposedly did the same thing, why would you keep the one owned by a powerful government?
I'd like to look into this and get back with your office.
It sounds like you applied different rules to the same apps.
We apply the rules to all developers evenly.
Did the fact that Apple had its own, Mr. Cook, let me just ask you this. Did the fact that Apple had its own parental control apps that were competing with these third-party apps contribute to Apple's decision to kick them off the Apple Store? Mr. Cook, what do you think about that?
It did not. There's over 30 parental controls on the App Store today. So there's plenty of competition in this area. And I would point out that this is not an area where Apple gets any revenue at all. We do this
Mr. Cook,
because
I didn't ask anything about revenue. That was not my question, but I'm out of time. And thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. And now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Zuckerberg, just as Mr. Pichai gave prior testimony to Congress saying there wasn't editorial manipulation, on their platform. You have previously given testimony to the Congress saying that there is not editorial manipulation that disadvantages conservatives. And just like in the case of Google, there have been whistleblowers from Facebook that not only have offered evidence indicating your testimony was not truthful, but there's even video that suggests that content moderators that you employ are out there disadvantaging conservative content. I'm wondering if you are familiar with the experiences of Zach McElroy and Ryan Hartwig, two people who participated in Facebook content review, and what is your response to the very damning video evidence and the testimony from them that the culture that you lead within Facebook is one that disadvantages conservatives and leads to content manipulation?
So, Congressman, I'm somewhat familiar with the concerns that they've raised, and as I've said, we aim to be a platform for all ideas. We got into this because we want to give everyone a voice. I certainly do not want our platforms to be run in a way that has any ideological bias, and I want people to be able to discuss a range of issues. When people raise concerns like that, we do look into them to make sure that that everyone in our operation is behaving and upholding the standards that we would like. And if the behavior that they cited is true, then that would be unacceptable in our operation.
And following the release of those videos and that evidence from Project Veritas, will you then describe the investigation that Facebook undertook to root out these very corrosive effects on your platform?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to you with more details on that, but I know that we have ongoing training in what we do, and we certainly will look into any complaints that come up, and we want to make sure that in how we run the content review teams, that it's done in a way that reflects the values of the company around giving everyone a voice and being a platform for all ideas.
I'm concerned that the content review does reflect the values of the company, but those values don't in fact give everyone a voice. They prejudice against certain content, and while I appreciate training as a prophylactic endeavor to try to guide future content, it seems disingenuous for you to suggest that these videos come out that are very damning, that show the people that you trust with content moderation admitting on video that they disadvantage conservatives, that they label people who support the president as a way to push down their content and limit the reach of that content, for you to then come to us many months later after that was all over the news and the internet and say, well, you know, you'll get back to us and you do a little training. It seems to suggest that you don't take these allegations and this evidence very seriously. And so I'll ask the question perhaps in a different way. Would you revise your in your prior testimony to Energy and Commerce, you said this does not happen, it cannot happen. Would you at least be willing to acknowledge, based on the irrefutable evidence before us that you don't seem to have investigated, that it is possible that at Facebook, your employees do have the power to disadvantage conservative viewpoints, and that they in fact have used that power in ways that we need to root out?
Congressman, my testimony in the past and today is about what our principles are as a company and what we try to do. Of course, when you have tens of thousands of employees, people make mistakes, people have some of their own goals some of the time, and it's our job in running the company to make sure that we minimize errors and that we make sure that the company's operations reflect the principles that we intend to run it on.
And when you fire people as a consequence of their politics, do you think that that impacts the culture and perhaps empowers some of the content moderators to also treat people worse as a consequence of their politics?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'm not aware of any case where we have fired someone on behalf of their politics, and I would say that that would be an inappropriate thing for us to do.
Why did you fire Palmer Luckey?
Congressman, I'm not sure it's appropriate to get into a specific personnel issue publicly,
I mean, I could just tell you that
but I can
Palmer
assure you that
Luckey's
it was
NDA
not.
with you, I only have 10 seconds, but Palmer Luckey's NDA with you doesn't allow him to talk to anyone except government officials. I'm a government official. I've seen the messages where you have specifically directed Mr. Luckey to make statements regarding his politics for the benefit of your company. So I think both in the case of these content moderators and in the case of the testimony you just gave regarding Mr. Luckey and firing people over their politics, there is serious question as to whether or not you're giving truthful testimony here or whether it's lying before Congress. I see my time's expired and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pache, I wanted to focus a little bit on Google's acquisition of YouTube and some of the consequences of that move for consumer privacy and competition. Now, Google purchased YouTube in 2006 after identifying it as a potential rival that could eventually draw business away from Google. And it's my understanding Google paid $1.65 billion for that acquisition, nearly 30 times its original bid of $50 million. So could you tell us why Google was willing to pay so much more beyond the initial proposed bid? And was this as a result of any analysis on the harm Google would suffer if a competitor had purchased YouTube?
Congresswoman, we acquired YouTube in 2006, and this was well before my time there as CEO, and I wasn't directly involved. But what I do recall at the time is that we saw it as a new emerging area, and our mission is to help users with information. We saw an opportunity, and it wasn't clear. YouTube only had 67 people.
Okay, was Mr. Page in charge of that decision?
Congresswoman, I wasn't directly involved, but I am pretty sure our senior leadership team at that time definitely looked into it.
Okay, I would encourage the subcommittee to take the steps necessary to have us hear from whoever was in charge of that. Moving on, Google is now by far the top online site where Americans watch videos, including children's videos. And as I'm sure you're aware, federal law prevents companies from collecting data on children under 13. However, just last year, the Federal Trade Commission found that Google had spent years knowingly collecting data on children under 13 on YouTube and offering advertisers the ability to target those children directly. Mr. Pache, did YouTube use the data it illegally acquired to improve its ability to target ads to children?
This is an area, I take it very seriously. I'm a parent too. We are committed. We have invested tremendously. We have a dedicated product for kids in YouTube Kids. On the main YouTube platform, we make sure we have clear policies. We enforce them rigorously. Just in Q4 of 2019, we flagged and removed almost close to 1 million videos, potentially for concerns around child safety. So it's an area we are investing rigorously and will continue to do so.
Well, I'm more concerned about the fact that you're investing rigorously in luring in advertisers like toy makers, Mattel, and Hasbro by telling them that YouTube is the #1 website regularly visited by kids. So that sounds like you're targeting the kids and then targeting advertisers to bring them on board. Is that correct?
Today, in the main site of YouTube, we don't allow anyone under 13 to create accounts. There are scenarios in which there could be family viewing, and today there are creators who create content oriented towards families, and as part of that, there are advertisers which are interested in connecting with those users. But everything we do here, we obviously comply with all the applicable regulations.
Okay, well, let's look at some of the content that is specifically for children. COPPA makes it illegal to target those kids, but we've got an issue where content creators are in a very difficult position now. So if a show like Sesame Street doesn't want to show ads for junk food on YouTube, does YouTube allow it to make that choice?
Today, we do, we have choices both for creators in terms of, tools and preferences, and we have extensive tools for advertisers, and above all for users, we give a choice. They can either use YouTube as a subscription service, without seeing those types of ads, or they can use it for free with ads. So we give choice, and for us, it is of utmost importance that YouTube is a place where people come to learn, and we find increasingly small and medium businesses use YouTube to thrive, especially even during COVID. Particularly met with many,
Let's
many
go back
businesses
to content that's designed for children. So, if there's an organization like Sesame Street that wants to provide child-centered content, but they don't want that content to be sullied, shall we say, with junk food ads or something, my understanding is that you say that the content creators can do that, but we've got a recent report from the Wall Street Journal that says YouTube hasn't been honoring those requests, and it's been making it difficult for independent auditing companies like OpenSlate to independently audit that and then report back to those content creators about whether or not YouTube is honoring those. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the particular report, but I'm happy to understand it better and have my office follow up with your staff, Congressman.
I would appreciate that. My time has expired. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair, would I recognize himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bezos, thank you for being here today. In your opening statement, I reviewed your written testimony. You indicated, and I'll just quote, that Amazon accounts for less than 1% of the $25 trillion global retail market and less than 4% of retail in the U.S. End quote, when you refer to retail, I take it based on the empirical studies I've reviewed, you're referring to a broad definition of retail that includes restaurants, bars, gas stations. So it's a fairly all-encompassing view of retail. I wonder if you know what percentage of Amazon's sales are represented in the terms of online retail sales, the e-commerce market stream.
The figures I've seen for, I don't.
Online retail sales, the e-commerce market stream.
The figures I've seen for, I don't.
You understand more than most that the early stages of a startup where entrepreneurs are undertaking risks to bring their products and services to market. Over the course of our investigation, we've heard directly from startups who rely on Amazon services, and that includes obviously Representative Jayapal's questions, Representative Buck, my colleague from Colorado, with respect to concerns about the way in which Amazon uses confidential information. But we've also heard that not just with respect to the marketplace, but Amazon's cloud computing arm, AWS, the notion that that computing arm essentially identifies startups' best technologies and rolls out replica products and services. So, Mr. Bezos, does Amazon use confidential information that companies share via AWS to build competing services?
No, sir, not that I'm aware of. AWS does often, they do keep expanding their services. AWS started, 15 years ago. We invented this entire category.
Let me just clarify that, Mr. Bezos. I appreciate that. Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. But last week, one of Amazon's former engineers posted online that he and his team, quote, proactively identified growing businesses on AWS, that they built competing products, and that they targeted those products to the business's customers. And there's been public reporting on that strategy. So I guess I wonder if you can comment on that and how you would account for those statements.
Well, I think there may be categories, some databases of different kinds and so on, where we see that it's an important product for customers, and we make our own product offering in that arena. But it doesn't mean we stop servicing the other companies that are also making those products. We have competitors using AWS, and we work very hard to make them successful. Netflix is one example, Hulu is another, and so on.
I think the concern, Mr. Bezos, with respect is that the pattern emerges across the different components in Amazon, whether it's the marketplace or whether it's the cloud service, as I mentioned. In addition, there was an article, I'm sure you're aware, in the Wall Street Journal regarding the Alexa Fund, that according to news reports, Amazon's venture capital fund, the Alexa Fund, had invested in a number of different companies. I believe you're familiar with the Alexa Fund investing, for example, in Defined Crowd Corp. Does that ring a bell?
No, sir, I'm afraid it doesn't.
Okay, well, I'll represent to you, according to the Wall Street Journal, and I'll just quote from them, when Amazon Incorporated's venture capital fund invested in Define Crowd Corp., it gained access to the technology startup's finances and other confidential information. Nearly 4 years later, in April, Amazon's cloud computing unit launched an artificial intelligence product that does almost exactly what Define Crowd does, said Define Crowd founder and chief executive Daniel Braja. Does that refresh your recollection? Are you aware of those allegations?
I read that article, but I didn't remember that piece of it. I apologize for that. I don't know the specifics of that situation, and I would be happy to get back to your office with more information about that.
Well, I would appreciate, I certainly would welcome that, and to the extent that you all can follow up with the subcommittee with respect to this particular article and the different episodes that are referenced, both in terms of Define Crowd Corp. There's also another company called Nucleus that you may be familiar with. The reason why I ask these questions, the reason why it matters, Mr. Bezos, to me, is that we are very concerned about this innovation kill zone that seems to be emerging. I represent Boulder and Fort Collins, two of the fastest growing and most innovative tech hubs in the country, and entrepreneurs and founders shared their stories with this committee during one of our field hearings, actually a field hearing that we held at the University of Colorado Law School just earlier this year. And they are extremely dependent on big technology firms, including in terms of investment and capital, yet they live in constant fear that the platforms could steal their core technologies or ideas, making it impossible to compete because of those existing advantages. So I see my time has expired, but we will certainly be following up with respect to the episodes that I referenced. With that, I would yield back. Gentleman's time has expired. And the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Macbeth, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cook, Facebook acquired WhatsApp in 2014, and at that time, Sheryl Sandberg told the board that the deal was critical for countering the App Store power of Apple and Google, who choke off Facebook's access to mobile devices. Was Sheryl Sandberg correct? Does Apple have the power to exclude apps from the App Store?
If you look at the history of this Congresswoman, we've increased the number of apps from 500 to 1.7 million. So there's a very wide gate for the App Store. And there's fierce competition for developers, and we want every app we can on the platform.
Okay, so but Mr. Cook, then what you're saying is that Apple can exclude apps from the App Store. In fact, it has. In 2018, Apple introduced an app called Screen Time, which helps people limit the amount of time they or their kids spend on their iPhones. Is that correct?
It sounds right.
Okay, but before Screen Time existed, there were other apps in the App Store that gave parents control over their kids' phone usage, apps like Our Pact and Kids Locks, and parents depended on them. Soon after you introduced Screen Time, however, you removed these competing apps from the App Store. One mother wrote to Apple saying, and I quote her, "I am deeply disappointed that you have decided to remove this app and others like it, thereby reducing consumer access to much-needed services to keep children safe and protect their mental health and well-being." Mr. Cook, why did Apple remove competing apps right after you released Screen Time?
We were concerned, Congresswoman, about the privacy and security of kids. The technology that was being used at that time was called MDM, and it had the ability to sort of take over the kid's screen, and a third party could see it. And so we were worried about their safety.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Today
that.
we have...
I appreciate that, but the timing of the removal seems very coincidental. If Apple wasn't attempting to harm competitors in order to help its own app, why did Phil Schiller, who runs the App Store, promote the Screen Time app to customers who complained about the removal of rival parental control apps?
Congresswoman, I can't see this email. I'm sorry, my eyes are not good enough to read it. But I see Screen Time as just an alternative, that there are over 30 parental control apps that are in the App Store today. And so there's vibrant competition for parental controls out there.
Okay. Well, Mr. Cook, the fact is that Apple sidelined Screen Time's competition by keeping them out of the App Store. And while Apple claims these competitors weren't meeting Apple's privacy standards, these apps creators say that you admitted them back in 6 months later without requiring significant privacy changes. And, of course, 6 months is truly an eternity for small businesses to be shut down. Even worse, if all the while a larger competitor is actually taking away customers. And, you know, this is not the first time something like this seems to have happened, Mr. Cook. Let me give you another example, you know, of the harm that's been caused to your competitors. In 2010, Apple introduced an online bookstore called the iBookstore, where it offered ebooks. And the only major publisher that didn't agree to join iBookstore was Random House. Random House wanted to offer its own ebooks through its own apps and submitted their apps to be added to the App Store. Amidst continued negotiations between Apple and Random House, Senior VP Eddie Q said, and I'm quoting him, I'm quoting him when he said, it prevented an app from Random House from going live in the App Store. Q himself cited this app rejection as a factor in finally getting Random House to give in and join iBookstore. Mr. Cook, is it fair for Apple to use its power over the App Store to pressure a business to join Apple's own app?
I can't see the email, and so I don't know the context of it, but there are many reasons why an app might not initially go through the App Store gate, because it may not work properly. There may be other issues with it, so it's very difficult to see. What I would say, though, on a macro basis, the gate to the App Store is very wide. We have 1.7 million apps in it. It's become an economic miracle with over $138 billion of commerce just in the United States.
Mr. Cook, I really, really appreciate that sentiment. But, you know, I want to say to you that Apple enjoys enormous power to control which apps can reach consumers. Even some of the largest companies in the country fear your power. Our evidence suggests that your company has used its power to harm your rivals and boost your own business. This is fundamentally unfair. It harms small businesses that rely on you to reach customers. It stifles the innovation that is the lifeblood of our economy. Ultimately, it reduces the competition and choices that are made available to consumers, and that is a great concern to all of us. And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. That concludes that round. In light of the request of Mr. Gates for a third round, and because many of my colleagues would like to get more fulsome answers on a number of issues, we'll proceed to a final round, and my expectation is we will conclude within the hour. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Zuckerberg, we've seen the dominance of several of the companies appearing before us today, that it's not just harmful to our economy and competition, but it's harmful to the founding principles of our democracy. Facebook and Google are designed to keep users on their platforms whatever the cost. Because disinformation, propaganda, and hateful speech are good for engagement, they're good for business. But over 100 years ago, the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. My first question is, Mr. Zuckerberg, do you agree with that principle, that there are limits to harmful and false speech, and that are particularly important when it comes to the health and safety of the public?
Congressman, I certainly do, and I actually think that our policies go further than just limiting those types of things.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, you have 1 billion users and almost 50,000 employees, and so you agree you have a responsibility to remove harmful lies from your platform, correct?
Congressman, I think we have a responsibility to limit the spread of content that's going to be harmful for people. And also, if you, I'd like to add that I do not believe that we have any incentive to have this content on our service. People don't like it.
Except that, Mr. Zuckerberg, with all due respect, except that it is often the most engaging. It's the most, it brings the most likes, or it brings the most activity, which of course produces great profit. So you do have an incentive. The more engagement there is, the more money you make on advertising. So let me ask you a question. Let me give you some specific examples that will illustrate my concerns. These are some of the top 10 most shared articles on Facebook in 2020. Trump suggests injection of disinfectant to beat coronavirus and clean the lungs. Coronavirus hype, biggest political hoax in history. U.S. hospitals getting paid more to label cause of death as coronavirus. During the greatest public health crisis of our lifetime, don't you agree that these articles viewed by millions on your platform will cost lives?
Congressman, with respect, we certainly have policies that prohibit false information about COVID that would lead to imminent harm. And we've been quite aggressive about taking that down, as some of the questioning from the other side of the aisle has shown so far.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg,
I'm quite proud of our efforts here.
Well, with all due respect, the problem is Facebook is profiting off and amplifying disinformation that harms others because it's profitable. This isn't a speech issue. It's about Facebook's business model that prioritizes engagement in order to keep people on Facebook's platform to serve up more advertisements. So I'll ask you very specifically, what are you doing right now to protect people from demonstrably false claims related to this deadly pandemic?
Congressman, I'll certainly answer that, but I have to disagree with the assertion that you're making that this content is somehow helpful for our business. It is not what people want to see, and we rank our what we show in feed based on what is going to be the most meaningful to people and is going to create long-term satisfaction, not what's just going to get engagement or clicks today. That's
Sir,
a common misperception about the company.
If that's true, Mr. Zuckerberg, how do you explain that on Monday, the second most popular post on Facebook was a Breitbart video claiming that you don't need a mask and hydroxychloroquine is a cure for COVID. And in the first 5 hours after being posted on Facebook, it racked up 20 million views and over 100,000 comments before Facebook acted to remove it.
Well, Congressman, a lot of people shared that, and we did take it down because it violates our policies. We work with the
After
CDC
20 million people saw it over the period of 5 hours. I mean, doesn't that suggest, Mr. Zuckerberg, that your platform is so big that even with the right policies in place, you can't contain deadly content?
Congressman, I don't think so. I think we have, on COVID misinformation in particular, a relatively good track record of fighting and taking down lots of false content, as well as putting up authoritative information. We have built a COVID information center
I understand
with authoritative information from health officials.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. I just have one more question for you.
2 billion people.
I appreciate that. Mr. Zuckerberg, if a television station runs a false political advertisement, they're held liable for that. Why should Facebook or any other platform be different? While you may not be a publisher, you're responsible maybe not for the first posting, but you then take that posting and you apply a set of algorithms that decide how you will disseminate that, which is a business decision, not a First Amendment decision. And it's hard to understand why Facebook shouldn't be responsible for those business decisions.
Congressman, in terms of political ads, we've modeled a lot of our policies off of the FCC guidelines on broadcasters and their requirements to run political ads equally from all different sides.
Well,
Cable
I
networks,
think this,
of course, have more.
Yeah, I think these examples, unfortunately, Mr. Zuckerberg, are just the tip of the iceberg. It's not just about COVID. Facebook hosts or enables countless pages and ads that are dedicated to conspiracy theories and calls to violence, including content that led to the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And Facebook gets away with it because you're the only game in town. There's no competition forcing you to police your own platform. Allowing this misinformation to spread can lead to violence. And frankly, I believe it strikes at the very heart of American democracy. And with that, I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Google meeting. You attended that meeting along with Sergey Brin. A video of that meeting was leaked to Breitbart. And at the meeting, top Google executives, including Kent Walker, lamented Trump's victory. They compared Trump voters to extremists. And it was discussed that there was an intent to make the Trump win a blip in the populist movement in American history. Now, I know you've testified today in response to my questions, and Mr. Jordan's questions that you don't intend this time to engage in electioneering on behalf of the former vice president. But given the video evidence of senior members of your team in your presence saying that they had the intent to make the Trump victory a blip, why should we believe that testimony today?
Congressman, we do not have a view on, we respect the democratic process. We are deeply committed to it. As a company, we take pride in the information we provide to help people participate in free elections. And we are deeply committed to it, as I said to Congressman Jordan as well.
Do you remember that meeting? 2016 that you attended?
Yes, I do. It was in the context of, through the election across both sides, there was a lot of opinions. And as you know, elections are kind of a polarizing moment generally in the country. And there was a lot of rhetoric about certain issues which were
I understand rhetoric. I guess the question is, when the senior members of your team in your presence said that they did have the intent to change the outcome in a subsequent election, and then since that moment in time where we've seen all of these conservative websites and conservative viewpoints censored, you can understand why people would be concerned. So after your employees and top executives said in your presence that they intended to make the Trump victory a blip, what action did you take as the CEO to protect and preserve the neutrality of your platform?
Congressman, no one had a view on, ever interfering with elections or so on. But what I can tell you is we've made it very clear about 2 years ago, we announced new community guidelines for within Google, clearly making it clear that, employees obviously are free to have their political views, but none of that they shouldn't bring that as they work on any of our products. And if we found any evidence that people are using a political agenda to manipulate any of our content platforms, we would take strong enforcement action.
We have sort of a string of events here. We have the 2016 meeting where people demonstrated their intent to make changes to hurt the president. Then we have your testimony today that's a little different than your testimony from December, where you say people can manipulate blacklists. And then you have the outcome where sites like Breitbart and Gateway Pundit and others see that disparate treatment. So it really doesn't take Sherlock Holmes here to connect the dots and see what Google's doing. I'm going to move on with my final 90 seconds, Mr. Bezos. I am deeply moved by your personal story. I am not here accusing you as someone who would ever traffic in hate, but it seems you have empowered people who do. And I'm particularly talking about the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which you allow to dictate who can receive donations on your Amazon Smile platform, have said the Catholic Family News, Catholic Family Ministries, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, the American Family Association, the Family Research Council, the Jewish Defense League, and even Dr. Ben Carson are extremists and should be treated differently. Dr. Carson is on the cabinet and is one of the most renowned minds in America. I'm just wondering why you would place your confidence in a group that seems to be so out of step and seems to take mainstream Christian doctrine and label it as hate.
Sir, it's a good question. We have, for those of you who don't know what Amazon Smile is, it's a program that allows customers to designate a certain fraction of their purchases to go to charity that we then pay for. And they can select from any one of millions of charities. And we use the Southern Poverty Law Center data to say which charities are extremist organizations. We also use the U.S. Foreign Asset Office to do the same thing.
But
those
why?
two together.
Since they're calling the Catholics and these Jewish groups hateful groups, why would you trust them?
Sir, I'm going to acknowledge this is an imperfect system, and
no doubt.
I would love suggestions on better or additional sources.
My suggestion would be a divorce from the SPLC, and I see that I'm out of time, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair. I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Facebook is dominant not just in the social media market, but also in its digital surveillance capabilities. In 2012, Facebook had several tools that allowed it to conduct digital surveillance, including trackers, Facebook's like button, Facebook login, and a series of application programming interfaces, or APIs. Mr. Zuckerberg, these tools provide Facebook with insights into its competitors' websites and apps. Isn't that correct? Yes or no?
Congressman, I think broadly the answer to what you're saying is yes.
Right.
We, every other company here, do market research to understand what people are finding valuable.
All right, okay, so you're going beyond the scope of my question. I appreciate that answer, though. Mr. Zuckerberg, a few days before Facebook acquired Instagram, a Facebook vice president emailed you suggesting ways to improve Facebook's, quote, competitive research, end quote. By building a custom model, Facebook could improve its understanding of its competitors and, quote, make more bold decisions on whether they are friends or foes, end quote. Mr. Zuckerberg, how does Facebook improve its competitive research to distinguish friends from foe?
Congressman, I'm not sure exactly what he was referring to in that email there, but he is one of the people involved in running our analytics organization, and I think it's natural that he would, as part of his responsibility, be focused on market research and understanding more there.
And certainly, isn't it true that Facebook, after that conversation, purchased the web analytics company Onevo in 2013 to give Facebook more capability to monitor its competitors?
Congressman, I think you have the timing correct. After we purchased Onavo as part of our broader market research capacity.
And that would give you the capability to monitor your competitors, correct?
Congressman, it gave aggregate analytics as to what people were using and what people were finding valuable. Sort of like the type of product you would get from Nielsen or Comscore, some of these other third-party companies that provide similar data.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, that acquisition gave you non-public real-time data about engagement, usage, and how much time people spend on apps. And when it became public that Facebook was using Onevo to conduct digital surveillance, your company got kicked out of Apple's App Store. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I'm not sure I'd characterize it in that way. I think this was part of a broader
Onevo did get kicked out of the App Store. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I believe we took the app out after Apple changed their policies.
And it was because of the use of the surveillance tools.
Congressman, I'm not sure that the policy was worded that way. Or that's exactly the right characterization of it. But
okay, well, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you this question. After Onevo was booted out of the App Store, you turned to other surveillance tools such as Facebook Research app, correct?
Congressman, in general, yes, we do a broad variety of market research, as do other
and
companies.
Also, isn't it true, Mr. Zuckerberg, that Facebook paid teenagers to sell their privacy by installing Facebook Research app?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that, but I think it's a general practice to be able to, that companies use to have different surveys and understand data from how people are using different products and what their preferences are.
Facebook Research app got thrown out of the App Store too, isn't that true?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, well, over nearly a decade, Mr. Zuckerberg, you led a sustained effort to surveil smaller competitors to benefit Facebook. These were steps taken to abuse data, to harm competitors, and to shield Facebook from competition. You tried one thing, and then you got caught, made some apologies, then you did it all over again. Isn't that true?
Congressman, I respectfully disagree with that characterization. I think every company engages in research to understand what their customers are enjoying so that they can learn and make their products better. And that's what we were trying to do. That's what our analytics team was doing. I think in general, that allowed us to make our services better for people to be able to connect in a whole lot of different ways, which is our goal.
Did you use that capability to purchase WhatsApp?
Congressman, it was one of the signals that we had about WhatsApp's trajectory, but we didn't need it. Without that, it was pretty clear that WhatsApp was a great product. I already had a relationship with Jan Koum, the founder.
And it was a competitor.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stubbe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for all four, yes or no answer. Do you believe that the Chinese government steals technology from U.S. companies? Start with Mr. Cook.
I don't know of specific cases where we have been stolen from by the government.
So you don't believe that the Chinese government's stealing technology from U.S. companies, or you're just saying that not from yours?
I'm saying I know of no case on ours where it occurred, which is I can only speak to firsthand knowledge.
Mr. Pichai, do you believe that the Chinese government steals technology from United States companies?
Congressman, I have no firsthand knowledge of any information stolen from Google in this regard.
Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, I think it's well documented that the Chinese government steals technology from American companies.
You're on mute.
Mr. Bezos, I believe you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I'm saying I have heard many reports of that, and I haven't seen it personally, but I've heard many reports of it.
So of all the different products that Amazon carries, you haven't seen that in any of the companies that sell products on Amazon or your company yourself?
Oh, well, certainly there are knockoff products, if that's what you mean, and there are counterfeit products and all of that. But the Chinese, if the answer is the Chinese government stealing technology, that's the thing I've read reports of, but don't have personal experience with.
It's no secret that Europe increasingly seems to have an agenda of attacking large, successful U.S. tech companies. Yet Europe's approach to regulation in general, and antitrust in particular, seems to have been much less successful than America's approach. America is a remarkable nursery for innovation and entrepreneurship in pursuit of the American dream. As you all know from direct experience, this is a country where it's possible to start a company from a garage or a dorm room and experience tremendous success. Do you have any recommendations on how Congress can better protect U.S. firms and U.S. companies from aggression and government intervention abroad, not just in Europe, but in China as well? Anybody that would like to chime in, I'll open it up to any of you. None of you have any recommendations on how Congress can better protect U.S. companies like yourself? All right, well, now I'll yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gates.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Zuckerberg, what is a digital land grab?
Congressman, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, in the emails that your company produced to the committee, there's one from David Wehner in 2014 where he's describing under the mergers and acquisitions advice within the company that you need to engage in a land grab. And he says, I hate the word land grab, but I think that's the best convincing argument, and we should own that. And it goes on to describe a strategy wherein Facebook would spend 5 to 10% of its market cap each year to shore up its market position. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes, Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to address this and frankly, to correct the record, because I believe that what he was referring to was a question that was incoming from investors about whether we would continue to acquire different companies. I don't think that wasn't referring to an internal strategy. It was referring to an external question that we were facing about how we would how investors should expect us to act going forward. And I think he was discussing the fact that as mobile phones were growing in popularity, there were a lot of new ways that people could connect and communicate that were part of this overall broader space and market around human connection and helping people stay connected and share their experiences.
Okay, well,
that
Mr.
were-
Zuckerberg, it seems to be both internal and external, because then in an email from you in 2012, we see a similar sentiment expressed. You write, "We can likely always just buy any competitive startups." So is your desire to limit competition by purchasing your competitors consistent with the message to your investors that the way you'll run your company is through digital land grabs?
Congressman, I'm not sure I agree with the characterization of how we communicated with investors. But
your words, Mr. Zuckerberg.
But I think the broader point is that there were a lot of new ways that people can connect that were created by smartphones.
But this is about your merger and acquisition strategy. You went on to say one thing about startups is you can often acquire them. So, I mean, I'm not interested in how people connect. I'm interested in how you acquire businesses to limit competition.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Congressman, in order to serve people better and help people connect in all the ways they would want, we innovated and built a lot.
Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about how to wear a non-medical mask, also known as fabric mask. Fabric masks can be used by the general public in areas where there are many people infected with COVID-19 in the community and physical distancing of at least 1 meter cannot be achieved. There are a wide variety of fabric masks that can be handmade or purchased in a store. They act as a barrier so that you can protect those around you. They should ideally be made of 3 layers of fabric. The outer layer should be a water-resistant fabric. The inner layer should be water absorbent, and the mid layer acts as a filter. First, clean your hands with alcohol-based hand rub or soap and water. Pick up your clean mask and inspect it. If it is damaged or dirty, do not wear it. Place the mask on your face, covering your nose, mouth, and chin, making sure there are no gaps between your face and the mask. Do not touch the mask while wearing it to avoid contamination. If you accidentally do, clean your hands. Before touching the mask, clean your hands with alcohol-based hand rub or soap and water. As you remove the mask, lean forward slightly and remove the loops from behind the ears without touching the front of the mask. And don't forget, wash your hands after taking off the mask. Make sure that you have your own mask and do not share it with anyone. If your fabric mask is not soiled or wet and you need to reuse it, you can store it in a clean plastic resealable bag such as this one. However, if it is dirty, do not use it. Wash it with soap and water, preferably at high temperatures after each day of use. Remember, a mask alone cannot protect you from COVID-19. It must be combined with protective measures, including maintaining at least 1 meter distance from others and washing your hands frequently. Stay safe and help prevent the spread of COVID-19.
At its heart, a discussion about competition is a discussion about opportunity. This has never been more important as the global pandemic poses dual challenges to our health and our economy. Expanding access to opportunity through technology is personal to me. I didn't have much access to a computer growing up in India, so you can imagine my amazement when I arrived in the US for graduate school and saw an entire lab of computers to use whenever I wanted. Accessing the internet for the first time set me on a path to bring technology to as many people as possible. It inspired me to build Google's first browser, Chrome. I'm proud that 11 years later, so many people experience the web through Chrome for free. Google takes pride in the number of people who choose our products. We are even prouder of what they do with them. From the 140 million students and teachers using G Suite for education to stay connected during the pandemic, to the 5 million Americans gaining digital skills through Grow with Google, to all the people who turn to Google for help, from finding the fastest route home to learning how to cook a new dish on YouTube. Google's work would not be possible without the long tradition of American innovation, and we are proud to contribute to its future. They employ more than 75,000 people in the US across 26 states. The Progressive Policy Institute estimated that in 2018, we invested more than $20 billion in the US, citing us as the largest capital investor in America that year, and one of the top 5 for the last 3 years. One way we contribute is by building helpful products. Research found that free services like Search, Gmail, Maps, and Photos provide thousands of dollars a year in value to the average American. And many are small businesses using our digital tools to grow. Stone Dimensions, a family-owned stone company in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, uses Google My Business to draw more customers. Gills Appliances, a family-owned appliance store in Bristol, Rhode Island, credits Google Analytics with helping them reach customers online during the pandemic. Nearly 1/3 of small business owners say that without digital tools, they would have had to close all or part of their business during COVID. Another way we contribute is by being among the world's biggest investors in research and development. At the end of 2019, our R&D spend had increased tenfold over 10 years, from $2.8 billion to $26 billion, and we have invested over $90 billion the last 5 years. Our engineers are helping America remain a global leader in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, and quantum computing. Just as America's technology leadership is not inevitable, Google's continued success is not guaranteed. New competitors emerge every day, and today users have more access to information than ever before. Competition drives us to innovate, and it also leads to better products, lower choices, and more choices for everyone. For example, competition helped lower online advertising costs by 40% over the last decade, with savings passed down to consumers. Open platforms like Android also support the innovation of others. Using Android, thousands of mobile operators build and sell their own devices without paying any licensing fees to us. This has enabled billions of consumers to afford cutting-edge smartphones, some for less than $50. Whether building tools for small businesses or platforms like Android, Google succeeds when others succeed. Competition also sets higher standards for privacy and security. I've always believed that privacy is a universal right, and Google is committed to keeping your information safe, treating it responsibly, putting you in control, and we've long supported the creation of comprehensive federal privacy laws. I've never forgotten how access to technology and innovation changed the course of my life. Google aims to build products that increase access to opportunity for everyone, no matter where you live, what you believe, or how much money you earn. We are committed to doing this responsibly in partnership with lawmakers to ensure every American has access to the incredible opportunity technology creates. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pichai. Mr. Cook is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cicilline and Nadler, Ranking Members Sensenbrenner and Jordan, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to offer testimony. Before I begin, I want to recognize the life and legacy of John Lewis. I join you in mourning not only a hero, but someone I knew personally, whose example inspires and guides me still. Every American owes John Lewis a debt, and I feel fortunate to hail from a state and a country that benefited so profoundly from his leadership. My name is Tim Cook. I've been Apple's CEO since 2011 and a proud employee of this uniquely American company since 1998. At Apple, we make ourselves a promise and our customers a promise. It's a promise that we'll only build things that make us proud. As Steve put it, we only make things that we'd recommend to our family and friends. You can try to define this difference in a lot of ways. You can call it the seamless integration of hardware and software. You can call it simplicity of design or a great ecosystem. All of those things are true. But if you want to put it simply, products like iPhone just work. When customers consistently give iPhone a 99% satisfaction rating, that's the message they're sending about the user experience. But we also know that customers have a lot of choices and that our products face fierce competition. Companies like Samsung, LG, Huawei, and Google have built successful businesses with different approaches. We're okay with that. Our goal is the best, not the most. In fact, we don't have a dominant share in any market or in any product category where we do business. What does motivate us is that timeless drive to build new things that we're proud to show our users. We focus relentlessly on those innovations, on deepening core principles like privacy and security, and on creating new features. In 2008, we introduced a new feature of the iPhone called the App Store. Launched with 500 apps, which seemed like a lot at the time, the App Store provided a safe and trusted way for users to get more out of their phone. We knew the distribution options for software developers at the time didn't work well. Brick and mortar stores charged high fees and had limited reach. Physical media like CDs had to be shipped and were hard to update. From the beginning, the App Store was a revolutionary alternative. App Store developers set prices for their apps and never pay for shelf space. We provide every developer with cutting-edge tools like compilers, programming languages, and more than 150,000 essential software building blocks called APIs. The App Store guidelines ensure a high-quality, reliable, and secure user experience. They are transparent and applied equally to every developer. For the vast majority of apps, developers keep 100% of the money they make. The only apps that are subject to a commission are those where the developer acquires a customer on an Apple device and where the features or services would be experienced and consumed on an Apple device. In the App Store's more than 10-year history, we have never raised the commission or added a single fee. In fact, we've reduced it for subscriptions and exempted additional categories of apps. I'm here today because scrutiny is reasonable and appropriate. We approach this process with respect and humility, but we make no concession on the facts. What began as 500 apps is now more than 1.7 million, only 60 of which are Apple software. If Apple is a gatekeeper, what we've done is open the gate wider. We want to get every app we can on the store, not keep them off. The App Store's economic contributions are significant. The ecosystem is responsible for 1.9 million jobs in all 50 states, and it facilitated $138 billion in commerce in the U.S. in 2019 alone. I share the committee's belief that competition promotes innovation, that it makes space for the next great idea, and that it gives consumers more choices. Since Apple was founded, these things have defined us. The first Mac brought opportunity and possibility into the home. The iPod helped musicians and artists to share their creations and be paid fairly for it. This legacy does much more than make us proud. It inspires us to work tirelessly to make sure tomorrow will be even better than today. Thank you very much. I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Zuckerberg is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I begin, I want to add my voice to those honoring Congressman John Lewis and his service to our country. America has lost a real hero who never stopped fighting for the rights of every person. Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Sensenbrenner, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The tech industry is an American success story. The products we build have changed the world and improved people's lives. Our industry is one of the ways that America shares its values with the world and one of our greatest economic and cultural exports. Facebook is part of this story. We started with an idea to give people the power to share and connect, and we've built services that billions of people find useful. I'm proud that we've given people who've never had a voice before the opportunity to be heard, and given small businesses access to tools that only the largest players used to have. Since COVID emerged, I'm proud that people have used our services to stay in touch with friends and family who they can't be with in person, and to keep their small businesses running online when physical stores are closed. I believe that Facebook and the US tech industry are a force for innovation and empowering people, but I recognize that there are concerns about the size and power of tech companies. Our services are about connection, and our business model is advertising, and we face intense competition in both. Many of our competitors have hundreds of millions or billions of users. Some are upstarts, but others are gatekeepers with the power to decide if we can even release our apps in their app stores to compete with them. In many areas, we're behind our competitors. The most popular messaging service in the US is iMessage. The fastest growing app is TikTok. The most popular app for video is YouTube. The fastest growing ads platform is Amazon. The largest ads platform is Google. And for every dollar spent on advertising in the US, less than 10 cents is spent with us. We're here to talk about online platforms, but I think the true nature of competition is much broader. When Google bought YouTube, they could compete against the dominant player in video, which was the cable industry. When Amazon bought Whole Foods, they could compete against Kroger's and Walmart. When Facebook bought WhatsApp, we could compete against telcos who used to charge 10 cents a text message, but not anymore. Now people can watch video, get groceries delivered, and send private messages for free. That's competition. New companies are created all the time, all over the world. And history shows that if we don't keep innovating, someone will replace every company here today. And that change can often happen faster than you expect. Of the 10 most valuable companies a decade ago, only 3 still make that list today. And if you look at where the top technology companies come from, a decade ago, the vast majority were American. Today, almost half are Chinese. Aside from competition, there are other serious issues related to the internet, including questions about elections, harmful content, and privacy. And while these are not antitrust issues and are not specifically the topic of today's hearing, I recognize that we are often at the center of these discussions. We build platforms for sharing ideas, and important debates play out across our services. I believe that this ultimately leads to more progress, but it means we often find ourselves in the middle of deep disagreements about social issues and high-stakes elections. I personally don't believe that private companies should be making so many decisions about these issues by themselves. And that's why last year, I made the case that there needs to be new regulation for the internet. Facebook stands for a set of basic principles: giving people voice and economic opportunity, keeping people safe, upholding democratic traditions like freedom of expression and voting, and enabling an open and competitive marketplace. These are fundamental values for most of us, but not for everyone in the world. Not for every company we compete with or the countries they represent. And as global competition increases, there is no guarantee that our values will win out. I'm proud of the services we build and how they improve people's lives. We compete hard. We compete fairly. We try to be the best. That's what I was taught matters in this country. And when we succeed, it's because we deliver great experiences that people love. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, and I thank the witnesses for your opening statements. Before I begin recognizing members for questioning under the 5-minute rule, without objection, I'm going to enter into the hearing record The documents and exhibits majority members will be referencing in their questioning today. These materials have been distributed to the witnesses. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bachai, over 85% of all online searches go through Google. Every online company in the United States depends on Google to reach users. A business may sink or swim based on Google's decisions alone. Numerous online businesses told us that Google steals their content and privileges its own sites in ways that profit Google but crush everyone else. Most businesses asked to stay anonymous due to fears that Google would retaliate against them. One entrepreneur, Brian Warner, told us his website was thriving until Google stole his content. After Google's decision, traffic to his website dropped by 80%. He had to downsize his business and lay off half his staff. He told us, and I quote, "If someone came to me with an idea for a website or a web service today, I'd tell them to run as far away from the web as possible. Launch a lawn care business or dog grooming business, something Google can't take away as soon as he or she is thriving." So my first question, Mr. Bachai, is why does Google steal content from honest businesses?
Mr. Chairman, with respect, I disagree with that characterization. Just last week, I met with many small businesses. In fact, today we support 1.4 million small businesses, supporting over $385 billion in economic activity. We see many businesses thrive, particularly even during the pandemic. Businesses, an example, Kettle Kings in Texas, which sells kettlebells. They've really
Mr. Bachai,
expanded.
I have a limited amount of time, so I don't want to interrupt you, but my question is very specific. We heard throughout this investigation that Google has stolen content to build your own business. These are consistent reports, and so your testimony that doesn't happen is really inconsistent with what we've learned during the course of the investigation, but I'll move on to a new question. Mr. Bachai, most Americans believe that when they enter a search query that what Google shows are the most relevant results. But increasingly, Google just shows whatever is most profitable for Google, be it Google Ads or Google's own sites. And so my question, Mr. Bachai, isn't there a fundamental conflict of interest between serving users who want to access the best and most relevant information and Google's business model, which incentivizes Google to sell ads and keep users on Google's own sites?
We've always focused on providing users the most relevant information, and we rely on that trust for users to come back to Google every day. In fact, a vast majority of queries in Google, we don't show ads at all, and we show ads only for a small subset of queries where the intent from users is highly commercial. For example, they may be looking for something like TV sets or so on.
But Mr. Bachai, what is the value of the part that you do use the Google ads for? I mean, it's a substantial part of your business. What's the actual value? 200 billion, 300 billion?
In terms of revenue, it's around $100+ billion. But
that's a lot of money, Mr. Bachai. Let me move on. Really, Mr. Bachai, it's Google's business model that is the problem. Our documents show that Google evolved from a turnstile to the rest of the web to a walled garden that increasingly keeps users within its sites. Emails show that over a decade ago, Google started to fear competition from certain websites, web pages that could divert search traffic and revenue from Google. These documents show that Google staff discussed the proliferating threat, is how it was described, that these web pages pose to Google. Any traffic lost to other sites was a loss in revenue. One of Google's memos observed that certain websites were getting, and I quote, too much traffic. So Google decided to put an end to that. Mr. Bachai, you've been at Google since 2004. Were you involved in these discussions about the threat from vertical search?
Congressman, without knowing the specifics, it's, I'm not fully clear of the context, but definitely when we look at vertical searches, it validates the competition we see. For example, when users come looking to shop online, independent studies show that over 55% of product searches originate with Amazon and over 70% originate with the major e-commerce companies. In the few categories which are commercial in nature, we see vigorous competition, be it travel, be it real estate, and we are working hard.
Let me ask very specifically, Mr. Bachai. The evidence that we collected shows that Google pursued a multi-pronged attack. First, Google began to steal other web pages' content. For example, in 2010, Google stole restaurant reviews from Yelp to bootstrap its own rival local search business. Mr. Bachai, do you know how Google responded when Yelp asked you to stop stealing their reviews? Well, I'll tell you, our investigation shows that Google's response was to threaten to delist Yelp entirely. In other words, the choice Google gave Yelp was, let us steal your content or effectively disappear from the web. Mr. Pichai, isn't that anti-competitive?
Congressman, when I run the company, I'm really focused on giving users what they want. We conduct ourselves to the highest standard. Happy to engage, understand the specifics, and answer your questions further.
Thank you. And just one final series of questions, Mr. Pichai. Did Google ever use its surveillance over web traffic to identify competitive threats?
Congressman, just like other businesses, we try to understand trends from data which we can see, and we use it to improve our products for our users. But we are really focused on improving our products, and that's how search
I appreciate
works.
that, Mr. Pichai. Google's own documents and numerous interviews with companies affected by this conduct show that Google did just that, which is very disturbing and very anti-competitive. In addition to stealing content, Google also began to privilege its own sites. An investigative report published just yesterday found that 63% of web searches that start on Google also end somewhere on Google's own websites. And to me, that's evidence that Google is increasingly a walled garden, which keeps users on Google sites, even if Google doesn't have the most relevant information and it's economically catastrophic for other companies online. And so my time is running out, but Mr. Pichai, I'll just end by saying the evidence seems very clear to me. As Google became the gateway to the internet, it began to abuse its power. It used its surveillance over web traffic to identify competitive threats and crush them. It has dampened innovation and new business growth, and it's dramatically increased the price of accessing users on the internet, virtually ensuring that any business that wants to be found on the web must pay Google a tax. And with that, I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Sensenbrenner, for his first round of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've been in Congress 42 years. That's coming to an end at the end of this year. I'm breathing a sigh of relief. But during that period of time, during the decade of the 90s and the zeros, I was involved as chairman of the Science Committee and chairman of this committee, and trying to make the net universal, and open it up to everybody. And one of the theses that we used is the net should end up becoming basically the debate on issues, not only in our country, but throughout the world. And in exchange for that, this committee and the Congress gave internet service providers immunity, so if somebody said something defamatory in what they posted, the ISPs could not be a part of a lawsuit for defamation. Now, after hearing Mr. Jordan give a long line of censorship of conservative viewpoints, I'm concerned that the people who manage the net, and the four of you manage a big part of the net, are ending up using this as a political screen. Conservatives are consumers too. And the way the net was put together in the eyes of Congress is that everybody should be able to speak their mind. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Jordan's litany of censorship zeroes in on Facebook. Exactly what are your standards in, quote, filtering out political speech that maybe some people out there don't agree with?
Congressman, thank you for the opportunity to address this. Our goal is to offer a platform for all ideas. We want to give everyone in the world a voice to share their experiences and ideas. A lot of that is day-to-day things that happen in their lives. Some of it is political. And frankly, I think that we've distinguished ourselves as one of the companies that defends free expression the most. We do have community standards around things that you can and cannot say. I think you would likely agree with most of them. They ban categories of harm such as promoting terrorist propaganda, child exploitation, incitement of violence, some more legalistic things like intellectual property violations, and they also ban things like hate speech that could lead to dehumanizing people and encouraging violence down the road.
If I may ask a specific of you, it was reported that Donald Trump Jr. got taken down for a period of time because he put something up on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. Now, I wouldn't take it myself, but there still is a debate on whether it is effective either in treating or preventing COVID-19. And I think that this is a legitimate matter of discussion, and it would be up to a patient and their doctor to determine whether hydroxychloroquine was the correct medication, given the circumstances. Now, why did that happen?
Congressman, well, first, to be clear, I think what you might be referring to happened on Twitter, so it's hard for me to speak to that. But I can talk to our policies about this. We do prohibit content that will lead to imminent risk of harm. And stating that there's a proven cure for COVID when there is, in fact, none, might encourage someone to go take something that could have some adverse effects. So we do take that down. We do not prohibit discussion around trials of drugs. Or people saying that they think that things might work, or personal experiences with experimental drugs. But if someone is going to say that something is proven when in fact it is not, that could lead people.
Wouldn't that be up for somebody on the other side of the issue to say that this is not proven? And, I know as a fact that, for people with certain conditions, it's contraindicated and they shouldn't take it on that. But wouldn't that be up to somebody else, to say, okay, what somebody posted on this really isn't true, and here's what the facts are, rather than having a Twitter or a Facebook take it down?
Congressman, in general, I agree with you, and we do not want to become the arbiters of truth. I think that would be a bad position for us to be in, and not what we should be doing. But on specific claims, if someone is going to go out and say that hydroxychloroquine is proven to cure COVID, when in fact it has not been proven to cure COVID, and that statement could lead people to take a drug that in some cases, some of the data suggests that it might be harmful to people, we think that we should take that down. That could cause imminent risk of harm.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the distinguished chair of the full Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, I want to thank you for providing us information during our investigation. However, the documents you provided tell a very disturbing story. And that story is that Facebook saw Instagram as a powerful threat that could siphon business away from Facebook. And so rather than compete with it, Facebook bought it. This is exactly the type of anti-competitive acquisition that the antitrust laws were designed to prevent. Now, let me explain what I mean. Mr. Zuckerberg, you have written that Facebook can likely always just buy any competitive startups. In fact, on the day Facebook bought Instagram, which you described as a threat, you wrote, quote, "One thing about startups is you can often acquire them," close quote. Mr. Zuckerberg, you were referring to companies like Instagram in that quote, weren't you?
Congressman, I don't have the exact document in front of me, but I've always been clear that we viewed Instagram both as a competitor and as a complement to our services. In the growing space around, after smartphones started getting big, and they competed with us in the space of mobile cameras and mobile photo sharing. But at the time, almost no one thought of them as a general social network. And people didn't think of them as competing with us in that space. And I think that the acquisition has been wildly successful. We were able to by acquiring them, continue investing in it and growing it as a standalone brand that now reaches many more people than I think either Kevin, the co-founder, or I thought would be possible at the time, while also incorporating some of the technology into making Facebook's photos sharing products better. So yes.
Okay. Now, in early 2012, when Facebook contemplated acquiring Instagram, a competitive startup, you told your CFO that though nascent, Instagram could be very disruptive to us. And in the weeks leading up to the deal, you described Instagram as a threat, saying that, quote, Instagram can meaningfully hurt us without becoming a huge business, unquote. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg, what did you mean when you described Instagram as a threat, as disruptive? And when you said that Instagram could meaningfully hurt Facebook, did you mean that consumers might switch from Facebook to Instagram?
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity to address this. At the time, there was a small but growing field of
Did you mean that consumers might switch from Facebook to Instagram? That was my question.
Thanks, Congressman.
Yes or no? Did you mean that?
In the space of mobile photos and camera apps, which was growing, they were a competitor. I've been clear about that. And
fine. In February of that year, in February 2012, you told Facebook's chief financial officer that you were interested in buying Instagram. He asked you whether the purpose of the deal was to neutralize a potential competitor or to integrate their products with ours in order to improve our services. You answered that it was a combination of both, saying what we're really buying is time. Even if some new competitors springs up, those products won't get much traction since we'll already have their mechanics deployed at scale. Mr. Zuckerberg, what did you mean when you answered that the purpose of the deal was to neutralize a potential competitor?
Congressman, well, those aren't my words, but yes, I've been clear that Instagram was a competitor in the space of mobile photo sharing. There were a lot of others at the time. They competed with apps like ViscoCam and PicPlease and companies like Path. It was a subset of the overall space of connecting that we exist in. And by having them join us, they certainly went from being a competitor in the space of being a mobile camera to an app that we could help grow and help get more people to be able to use and be on our team. And I think that's been wildly successful.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, mergers and acquisitions that buy off potential competitive threats violate the antitrust laws. In your own words, you purchased Instagram to neutralize a competitive threat. If this was an illegal merger at the time of the transaction, why shouldn't Instagram now be broken off into a separate company?
Well, Congressman, I think the FTC had all of these documents and reviewed this and unanimously voted at the time not to challenge the acquisition. I mean, I think with hindsight, it probably looks like obvious that Instagram would have reached the scale that it has today, but at the time it was far from obvious. A lot of the competitors that they competed with in mobile sharing, including companies like Path, which were hot at the time and had great founders and entrepreneurs running them. Dave Moore and I worked closely with him. I mean, I don't even think Path exists today. It was not a guarantee that Instagram was going to succeed. The acquisition has done wildly well, largely because not just of the founders' talent, but because we invested heavily in building up the infrastructure and promoting it and working on security and working on a lot of things around this. And I think that this has been an American success story.
Well, thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, you're making my point. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I want to end where I began. Facebook, by Mr. Zuckerberg's own admission and by the documents we have from the time, Facebook saw Instagram as a threat that could potentially siphon business away from Facebook. And so rather than compete with it, Facebook bought it. This is exactly the type of anti-competitive acquisition that the antitrust laws were designed to prevent. This should never have happened in the first place. It should never have been permitted to happen, and it cannot happen again. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would remind the witness that the failures of the FTC in 2012, of course, do not alleviate the antitrust challenges that the chairman described. And with that, I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Colorado and again thank him for co-hosting one of the most important field hearings we had along with Mr. Neguse in Colorado that I think was very critical in this investigation. And you're recognized from 5 minutes, Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to offer my appreciation to you for the bipartisan way that you have approached the subcommittee's investigation. I want to start by saying that capitalism is the greatest instrument for freedom this world has ever seen. Capitalism has given the United States the freedom and means to defeat the Soviet Union, beat back fascism, and put a man on the moon. This economic system has lifted millions out of poverty. It has made America the freest, most prosperous nation in the world. Our witnesses have taken ideas born out of a dorm room, a garage, a warehouse, and built these dreams into 4 of the biggest power players in the digital global economy: You have all enjoyed the freedom to succeed. Now, let me be clear. I do not believe big is necessarily bad. In fact, big is often a force for good. However, I want to address one particularly disturbing issue. Mr. Pichai, in October 2018, Google dropped out of the running for a Pentagon contract to complete the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, or JEDI contract, which was valued at more than $10 billion. Google's stated reason for removing itself from the bidding process is that the U.S. military's project did not align with Google's corporate values and principles. This is the same U.S. military that fights for our freedoms and stands as a force for good across the globe. These are the same soldiers, sailors, and airmen that sacrifice their lives to ensure you have the freedom to build your company and set your corporate policies without fear of government interference, unlike in communist China. I also find it very interesting that only months after making this decision to withdraw from the JEDI contract, Marine General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned the Senate Armed Forces Committee that the Chinese military was directly benefiting from Google's work. It made me wonder what values Google and communist Red China had in common. I asked myself, is it that the Chinese Communist Party imprisons Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, like it is shown on the chart behind me? Could it be that China forces slaves to work in sweatshops? Maybe they align on the design to suppress free speech in Hong Kong. Did Google agree with CCP's decision to lie to the world about the COVID-19 pandemic? Then I thought about Google's Dragonfly experiment. I wondered if perhaps you agreed with the Chinese government's use of technology platforms to spy on its own people and enforce draconian security laws. Maybe it's that your company is aligned with the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage policies, where the strategy is to steal whatever can't be produced domestically. These values that allow Google to work with the Chinese military but not the U.S. military help explain why Google wouldn't think twice about blatantly stealing a competitor's product, right down to the watermark, without any hint of attribution. Mr. Pichai, during our field hearing in my home state of Colorado, I heard a story that sounded so brazen and contrary to free market principles that I thought it must have been straight from the Chinese Communist Party's corporate espionage playbook. Google took advantage of a company that relied on your search engine to build its brand and compete. Google misappropriated lyrics from Genius Media Group's website and published those lyrics on Google's own platform. However, Genius caught Google in the act, quite literally red-handed. When Genius suspected this corporate theft was occurring, the company incorporated a digital watermark in its lyrics that spelled out red-handed. In Morse code, Google's lyric boxes contained the watermark, showing that your company stole what you couldn't or didn't want to produce yourself. After Google executives stated that they were investigating this problematic behavior, Genius created another experiment to determine the scope of the misappropriation. It turns out that out of 271 songs where the watermark was applied, 43% showed clear evidence of matching. Your company, which advertises itself as a doorway to freedom, took advantage of this small company, all but extinguishing Genius's freedom to compete. Google is supposed to connect people to information. Your corporate values once stood for freedom, a platform that let capitalism flourish and helped bring countless people across the globe out of poverty. My question to you, Mr. Pichai, do you think that Google could get away with following China's corporate espionage playbook if you didn't have a monopolistic advantage in the market?
Congressman, I want to be able to address the important concerns you raised. First of all, we are proud to support the U.S. government. We recently signed a big project with the Department of Defense where we are bringing our world-class zero trust-based cybersecurity approach to help protect Pentagon networks from cybersecurity attacks. We have projects underway with the Navy, with Department of Veterans Affairs. Happy to follow up and explain more. We have a very limited presence in China. We don't offer any of our services, search, maps, Gmail, YouTube, etc. in China. And with respect to music, we license content there. In fact, we license content from other companies. And so this is a dispute between Genius and the other companies in terms of where the source of the content is. But again, happy to engage and explain what we do here further.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cook, with over 100 million iPhone users in the United States alone, and with Apple's ownership of the App Store, giving Apple the ability to control which apps are allowed to be marketed to Apple users, you wield immense power over small businesses to grow and prosper. Apple is the sole decision maker as to whether an app is made available to app users through Apple's App Store. Isn't that correct?
Sir, the App Store, thank you for the questions. The App Store is a feature of the iPhone, much like the camera is and the chip is.
Yeah.
And so
my point is, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to get to the point. Point is that Apple is the sole decision maker as to whether an app is made available to app users through the Apple Store. Isn't that correct?
If it's a native app, yes, sir. If it's a web app, no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And throughout our investigation, we've heard concerns that rules governing the App Store review process are not available to the app developers. The rules are made up as you go. They are arbitrarily interpreted and enforced and are subject to change whenever Apple sees fit to change. And developers have no choice but to go along with the changes, or they must leave the App Store. That's an enormous amount of power. Also, the rules get changed to benefit Apple at the expense of app developers, and the App Store is said to also discriminate between app developers with similar apps on the Apple platform, and also as to small app developers versus large app developers. So, Mr. Cook, does Apple not treat all app developers equally?
Sir, we treat every developer the same. We have open and transparent rules. It's a rigorous process. Because we care so deeply about privacy and security and quality, we do look at every app before it goes on. But those rules apply evenly to everyone. And as you can tell by going from...
Some developers are favored over others, though. Isn't that correct?
That is not correct. And as you can tell from going from just 500...
I'll give you an example. Baidu has two App Store employees assigned to help it navigate the App Store bureaucracy. Is that true?
I don't know about that, sir.
Well, you don't have other app developers who have that same access to Apple personnel, do you?
We do a lot of things with developers, including looking at their beta test apps, regardless of whether they're small or large.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. Apple has negotiated exceptions to its typical 30% commission for some apps like Amazon Prime. Is a reduced commission such as the one that Amazon Prime gets available to other app developers?
It's available to anyone meeting the conditions, yes.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Apple requires all app developers to use Apple's payment processing system if those developers want to sell their goods or services to Apple users through Apple's App Store. Isn't that correct?
That is correct, because it's
by processing payments for apps that you allow into the App Store, you collect their customer data and you use that data to inform Apple as to whether or not it would be profitable for Apple to launch a competing app. Isn't that correct?
Sir, 84% of the apps are charged nothing. The remaining 16% either pay 15 or 30, depending upon the specifics. If it's in the second year of a subscription, as an example, it only pays 15%. If you look back at history...
What's to stop Apple from increasing its commission to 50%?
Sir, we have never increased commissions in the store since the first day it operated in 2008.
There's nothing to stop you from doing so, is it?
No, sir, I disagree strongly with that. There is a competition for developers just like there's a competition for customers. And so the competition for developers, they can write their apps for Android or Windows or Xbox or PlayStation. So we have fierce competition at the developer side and the customer side, which is essentially, it's so competitive, I would describe it as a street fight for market share in the smartphone business.
Has Apple ever retaliated against or disadvantaged a developer who went public about their frustrations with the App Store?
Sir, we do not retaliate or bully people. It's strongly against our company culture.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Mr. Zuckerberg, in his written testimony, made the claim that Facebook is an American company with American values. Do any of the rest of you take a different view? That is to say that your companies don't embrace American values. It's great to see that none of you do. Mr. Pichai, I'm worried about Google's market power, how it concentrates that power, and then ultimately how it wields it. Project Maven was a collaboration between Google and the Department of Defense that Google pulled out of, citing ethical concerns, and you made the decision to pull out of that joint venture following receipt of a letter from thousands of your employees saying that Google should not be in the business of war. My question, Mr. Pichai, is did you weigh the input from your employees when making the decision to abandon that project with the United States military?
Congressman, thanks for your concern. As I said earlier, we're deeply committed to supporting the military and the U.S. government. We have undertaken several projects since then. We do take our employees' input into account, but it's one input. We make decisions based on a variety of factors. As a company, we were new in the cloud space at that time. Since then,
thank you. That's a sufficient answer, that you did take their feedback into account. And in fact, some of your Googlers have recently sent you a letter where they've asked you to exit other partnerships as a consequence of ethical concerns. They've asked you to stop doing business with American law enforcement, saying that police broadly uphold white supremacy and that Google should not be engaged in any services to police. And as you well know, you provide some of the most basic services to police, like email, but you also provide services that help keep our cops safe when they're doing their job. And so my question is here in front of Congress and the American people, will you take the pledge that Google will not adopt the bigoted anti-police policy that is requested in the most recent letter?
Congressman, we have a long track record of working with law enforcement when it is supported by due process and the law. We push back against overbroad requests. We are transparent about the requests we get, but we have a long history of following the law and cooperating with law enforcement.
I understand the history. I'm asking about the future. To the law enforcement that are watching today, can they rest assured that under your leadership, Google will not adopt these bigoted anti-police policies?
Congressman, we are committed to continuing to work with law enforcement in a way that's consistent with law and due processes in the U.S.
Well, I greatly appreciate that, and I know that will be very comforting to the police who utilize your services. You mentioned earlier in the discussion about China that your engagement in China was very limited, but yet Google has an AI China Center. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has published a paper saying that enhanced the targeting capabilities of China's J-20 fighter aircraft. You collaborate with Chinese universities that take millions upon millions of dollars from the Chinese military. Matter of fact, one of your Googlers, Fifi Li, while under your employ, was cited in Chinese state media saying, "China is like a sleeping giant. When she wakes, she will tremble the world." The former Secretary of Defense, Mr. Shanahan, said that the lines have been blurred in China between commercial and military application. And as Mr. Buck cited, General Dunford says that your company is directly aiding the Chinese military. And Peter Thiel, who actually serves on Mr. Zuckerberg's board at Facebook, said that Google's activities with China are treasonous. He accused you of treason. So why would an American company with American values so directly aid the Chinese military, but have ethical concerns about working alongside the U.S. military on Project Maven? And I understand your point about cybersecurity and those things, but Project Maven was a specific way to ensure that our troops are safe on the battlefield. And if you have no problem making the J-20 Chinese fighter more effective in its targeting, why wouldn't you want to make America as effective?
Congressman, with respect, we are not working with the Chinese military. It's absolutely false. I had a chance to meet with General Dunford personally. We have clarified what we do in China compared to our peers. It's very, very limited in nature. Our AI work in China is limited to a handful of people working on open source projects, and happy to share and engage with the office to explain our work in China further.
Gosh, I mean, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says that an American company is directly aiding China, when you have an AI center, when you're working with universities, and when your employees are talking about China trembling the world, it seems to really call into question your commitment to our country and our values. I see my time's expired. I hope we have an additional round, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zuckerberg, as you know, the proliferation of fake Facebook accounts was a key tool in the strategy of Russian interference in the American election in 2016. American law enforcement, the Senate, the House have all found that Vladimir Putin engaged in a sweeping and systematic campaign to undermine American democracy in 2016 and to work for a victory for Donald Trump. In his remarkable book, Mind Blank, and I'm being polite here, Cambridge Analytica and the Plot to Break America, whistleblower Christopher Wiley, who worked for several years at Cambridge Analytica, recounts how the Russian assault on America in Cambridge Analytica's research depended on Facebook. Quote, when Cambridge Analytica launched in the summer of 2014, Steve Bannon's goal was to change politics by changing culture. Facebook data, algorithms, and narratives were his key weapons. The Cambridge Analytica team used these tools to identify people who exhibited the 3 traits in what they called the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. They then proceeded to bombard and activate these people, a small percentage of the American public, but still millions of people, with increasingly dark and manipulative messages from fake Facebook pages, both to get them to vote for Trump, but more importantly, to activate them as racists and white nationalists. And he goes on to describe the remarkable success of this campaign, both electorally, but also politically in the country in terms of sowing the terrible racial and ethnic divisions that you see in America today. So they waged a mass campaign of psychological warfare to polarize America around race and religion and to activate racists and anti-Semites. And it worked splendidly for them, but it didn't work so well for America. So Mr. Zuckerberg, which parts of this narrative have you addressed, or are you planning to address, or do you just see that essentially as the cost of being a forum and a marketplace for ideas? Is there nothing that can be done about the use of Facebook to engender social division in America?
Congressman, thank you. Since 2016, there have been a lot of steps that we've taken to protect the integrity of elections. We've hired, I think it's more than 30,000 people to work on safety and security. We've built up AI systems to be able to find harmful content, including being able to find more than 50 different networks of coordinated and authentic behavior, basically nation states trying to interfere in elections.
Can I pause you? Let me just pause you there for a second, because I'm interested in that. The Stop Hate for Profit campaign is a coalition that includes the Color of Change, the Anti-Defamation League, and other civil rights groups, and they're targeting Facebook right now for a boycott because of the rapid spread of hate messages online, the presence of Boogaloo and other right-wing extremist groups trying to infiltrate and disrupt Black Lives Matter protests, and the fact that alt-right, racist, and anti-Semitic content flourishes on Facebook. So they're asking you to remove these pages and essentially to join the movement for civil rights by not allowing that kind of content. They're Their boycotters include a lot of big companies, including Patagonia, Levi's, McDonald's, VW, Heineken, and so on. But you seem not to be that moved by their campaign, and I just wonder what you think about what they're asking you to do.
Congressman, thanks. We're very focused on fighting against election interference, and we're also very focused on fighting against hate speech. And our commitments to those issues and fighting them go back years before this recent movement. Since 2016, the defenses that the company has built up to help secure elections, not just in the US, but around the world, I think are some of the most advanced that any company or government has in the world now. We routinely now collaborate with law enforcement and intelligence agencies and are able to sometimes identify threats coming from other countries before governments are even able to. In terms of fighting hate, we've built really sophisticated systems. Our goal is to identify it before anyone even sees it on the platform. And we've built AI systems and, as I mentioned, have tens of thousands of people working on safety and security with the goal of getting this stuff down so that way before people even see it. And right now, we're able to proactively identify 89% of the hate speech that we take down before I think it's even seen by other people. So, I want to do better than 89%. I'd like to get that to 99%. But we have a massive investment here. We invest billions of dollars.
Just my time's almost out. Can you just address the proliferation of fake accounts? I understand annually you get 6.5 billion fake accounts produced there, but in some sense you have a profit motive that's linked to that because that's what's reported to your investors, the number of accounts. Are you working zealously to try to ferret out these fake accounts that are used to spread hate and disinformation?
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness may answer the question.
Congressman, absolutely. We work hard on this. We take down billions of fake accounts a year. A lot of that is just people trying to set up accounts to spam people for commercial reasons. A very small percent of that are nation states trying to interfere in elections, but we're very focused on trying to find those. Having fake and harmful content on our platform does not help our business. It hurts our business. People do not want to see that stuff, and they use our services less when they do. So we are aligned with people in order to take that down, and we invest billions of dollars a year in doing so.
Yield back. Thank you.
The committee will stand in recess for 10 minutes while we fix a technical feed with one of our witnesses.